We're going to spend the next half hour talking about a new book that has been getting a fair amount of attention, including in the New York Times this past Sunday. It's called Bombshell, The Secret Story of America's Unknown Atomic Spy Conspiracy. Joseph Albright, one of the co-authors of the book. Good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Mr. Scully.
And Marcia Kunstall, also one of the co-authors. Who is Ted Hall?
Ted Hall, at the moment, is a retired biophysicist who's living in Cambridge, England. However, the reason that we wrote about him is because when he was 18 years old, he was basically a prodigy, a physicist at Harvard who was recruited to become a scientist at the Los Alamos bomb project during World War II. And while he was there, he decided that he was going to share the information that was just being developed and being discovered about the bomb. He wanted to share that with the Soviet Union.
Joseph Albright, during the time that he was involved in this, we've also in our history books have read about the Rosenbergs and the Alger Hiss case. Why didn't his name come up during investigations into possible espionage activities by Americans toward the former Soviet Union?
You know, this is a altogether new story. It has not come out. So at the time the Rosenberg's trial, Ted Hall was at large and still part of the Soviet network. The FBI had some clues about his existence, but wasn't able to accumulate enough information to prosecute. So now what we're hearing about, which cast a whole new light about the Rosenberg case, has never been published before.
How did you first hear about him?
You know, we were foreign correspondents based in Moscow for the last 4 years. And one day we were reading in the paper, in the Russian papers, intriguing interview with a retired American living in Moscow in exile who had been part of the KGB network, a man named Morris Cohen, who at that time was still alive. And we thought, what a wonderful Sunday story if we could interview this man and find out all about his story. He's a man who'd served in the Spanish Civil War, he'd been a football player. He had a very interesting career. It sounds to us what a great story. So we kept pursuing this, and we kept looking, dealing with the KGB, trying to get an interview with this person. Well, we spent so much time on this and never wrote the story because we could never persuade them to let them give us an interview, that we became intrigued with it. And then another little clue was released in 1995 when the National Security Agency released the files of the decrypted wartime intelligence cables of the Soviet Union, which America's code breakers had broken these codes. Finally, when these codes, decoded documents were released, suddenly there was a little clue about the existence of Ted Hall, and we put it together with what we'd learned from the Moscow archives, and suddenly we decided we had to spend the extra time, and we went and knocked on Mine's door in Cambridge, England, and somehow he agreed to talk to us.
Our phone lines are open. We want to hear from you. The number's on the bottom of the screen. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the book. First, this is early on, page 36. You write that as an adolescent, Ted Hall manifested the same puckish, nonconformist streak that would follow him to Los Alamos and beyond. Why was he a nonconformist?
You mean in what way did he
in his early
evidence
years? You talk about his Jewish upbringing, what happened with Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany, where 91 Jews were killed. You also talk about his often wrath toward the Jewish religion.
Well, I think that he was nonconformist in the sense that he was sort of a practical joker, for one thing. He was sort of a rebel in that he didn't want to accept his parents' religion. His family was Jewish. They were not Orthodox, but the religion was important to his family, and he just didn't want to have much to do with it. He did not want to be bar mitzvahed, although he finally did do that. When he did have the bar mitzvah, he made a little political speech rather than sort of the more traditional kind of religious speech. So even at a very early age, when he was only 13, he was very political, and he had a lot of interest in things, you know, social and economic as well as just scientific. In fact, he told us that there were three things that he thought he wanted to be when he grew up. One was a journalist, one was a comedian, and the other was a physicist. So he had he was a complex person from a very early age.
You begin chapter 14 by saying that Ted Hall was just one minute cog in the Manhattan Project. So why is he such a big player in your eyes in his role with the Soviet Union?
Well, you're absolutely right. He was a small cog in the Manhattan Project, but even at the age of 18 and 19, this guy was so smart that he played a fundamental part in the definition of the critical mass needed to have a uranium bomb. And if you look in the archives at Los Alamos, you'll find that these technical histories of Los Alamos credits him with this remarkable achievement at the age of 18 years old, the result of which he was promoted onto the team that was studying the implosion. They had an implosion experiment that went on for several months to pre-test whether the implosion was going to work. And as the result of this, he was given the assignment of assembling and disassembling these dummy bombs. He would have them off in the cabin, so he would, of course, know the exact dimensions of the plutonium bomb that was later dubbed Fat Man. So that when he made this decision that in order to save the stability of the world, to prevent the Americans from having a nuclear monopoly, at the age of 19, and when he decided that the Russians ought to have this information, he had it. He was right at the heart of the atomic bomb project. He knew as much about implosion as Oppenheimer did.
This is a picture that, as we mentioned earlier, is in the New York Times Sunday magazine, September 14th. He and his wife, Joan, earlier this year, and again, he lives in Cambridge, England?
Yes, that's right.
You have at the very end of the book what you call aftershock. Early this year, he responded to a number of inquiries, apparently, that you had made, asking him to respond. How did you hear from him?
How did we hear from him?
How did you hear from Ted Hall?
Initially.
Well, you had asked him to respond to this book or to interview him, and then you write that early in 1997, when we were finishing the manuscript for this book,
right,
Theodore Hall finally gave us the statement we had been urging him to compose.
Right. This was a statement that he wrote for us after we'd had about 100 hours of interviews. So we had talked with him at length, and we wanted him to write a statement or to give us some sort of a commentary in his own words about what he thought he had done, why he had done it, what he felt now about it. And this was the statement that he finally came up with. This was sort of his definitive summary of really all of this whole story that our book tells.
Two sentences. In 1944, I was 19 years old, immature, inexperienced, and far too sure of myself. From the perspective of my 71 years, I still think that brash youth had the right end of the stick. I am no longer that person, but I am by no means ashamed of him.
That pretty much sums up what he told us in the course of these 100 hours of interviews. You know, a lot of this time we spent with him was trying to reconstruct his years at Harvard, his years when he was a member of this school in New York, the Townsend Harris High School for gifted boys at that time, his later scientific career, so we could put this whole story in context. We were not talking the whole time about Los Alamos by any means.
The book is called Bombshell. We'll get a call from Hendersonville, North Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask the authors about the papers that were released by the government last year. Venona, are you familiar with them?
Yes, yes, that was a very important part of our book, actually.
Why has that information not been passed on to the American public? Why is that such a deep secret in these papers, which were strictly decoding of messages that were kept secret for 50 years? Why is that such a secret?
Well, our understanding of it is that the American government did not want the Soviet government to know what they knew. You know, when a government develops a code, the government sometimes may use a similar code later, or they may use pieces of it. In this case, the Soviet Union stopped using this particular code, but the Americans hoped that they might still be able to pick up hints of what the Russians were doing by having the code that they did break. And they didn't want the Russians to know that they knew about it, or else they would have just completely stopped using any of the same kind of codes. That's my understanding of it. You know, there are a lot of people who agree with you that this information should have come out much earlier. Senator Patrick Moynihan is one of the people who was pressing the National Security Agency for quite some time to release these documents because they do have a very great historic value.
Is this the decrypted code that you received in 1995? They have, I think it's Theodore Cole, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
And Seville Sachs?
This is the Russian pronunciation of their names, yeah. These codes were transmitted from New York to Moscow. They were originally written in Russian and then translated into numbers and sent by RCA cable. And since there was, America was under wartime censorship at this time, copies of these cables were received by the American government. They just stayed in warehouses for years because nobody could make out what these numbers meant. But as our book tells, we had some very brilliant code breakers at the Army Security Agency, and by reading these numbers in detail, as our book explains, they were able to see some patterns in these numbers and find out what they meant, and they were able to therefore read them and turn them into these 2,000 documents, which were released only about a year and a half ago, and which, as Marcia said, is one of the bases of our book.
Did you write the book in Moscow primarily? I know you worked for Cox Newspapers over there.
Yes, we did write it in Moscow.
New York City, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask the authors, a book was written, I believe, a couple of years ago by a former KGB principal saying that Oppenheimer had shared atomic secrets. Can they shed any light on this?
Yes, I think our book does shed some new light on this subject. The book by General Sudoplatov mentioned a certain code name, Mlad, as the name of the Soviet agent at Los Alamos who had passed on this information. And as our book points out, it was actually Ted Hall who was Mlad. So as we've said in the book, the likelihood is that is lessened that Oppenheimer had anything to do with this.
Midway through the book, page 177, you write, for both Ted and Joan Hall, joining the Communist Party was a step past a fail-safe point. This was clearly not the route scientists followed if they expected to be awarded the best jobs at the nation's prestigious institutions.
Well, that's certainly our view, that if one wanted to become a part of the scientific establishment at the very highest levels, one wouldn't go and join the Communist Party. However, Ted Hall and his wife Joan felt very strongly about their politics. They really didn't feel it, I think, on an international level as much as on a local level. In their own backyard, they thought it was important to be active in the radical political movements, to be doing things like helping the packing house workers union in Chicago, to be keeping up with the Daily Worker, to be dealing with social issues that were important to them. And in fact, that was when he left the Soviet spy network, because he felt that he couldn't, that he really didn't have that much more to contribute to the Soviet spy network, and he would much prefer to be out front doing political things, and he couldn't really do both of them.
How long did he work on the project?
Ted Hall went to Los Alamos in January 1944 when there was only 600 people there, so he was one of the, not the very first people who got there, but among the first wave of young scientists who went there. And he stayed there after Oppenheimer left, after the first team left. He stayed there until the spring of 1946.
Could he be brought to trial now?
I think it would be very unlikely that there could be a successful prosecution now because all the eyewitnesses who were involved with him in the Soviet network have since died. We write about this in the book. He had several co-conspirators whose names we know and who the FBI knows their names, but the FBI seriously investigated Ted Hall starting in 1950 and continuing off and on through at least 1963. We're never able to make a case then when all these eyewitnesses were alive, and now that they're dead, I think it's unlikely that he could be prosecuted.
What has he been doing for the last 30 or 40 years?
Making distinguished contributions to the field of biophysics. Theodore Hall is the inventor of what in biophysics is known as the Hall method. It's a method of using electron microscopes for measuring and mapping the content, the trace elements within a cell.
West Point, Mississippi, our next call. Good morning.
I was wondering about David Greenglass. He was a brother of Mrs. Ethel Rosenberg. Is that mentioned in the book? I recently read the book The Dark Sun. And I was wondering if Hall mentioned David Greenglass in the thing. He was a machinist out there at Los Alamos.
Mr. Albright?
Interestingly enough, David Greenglass and Ted Hall were in the same military unit at Los Alamos, the Special Engineering Detachment, although Hall and Greenglass have both maintained that they did not know each other. Yes, we do mention, we try to sort out in our book the relative degree of importance of the contributions of David Greenglass, Theodore Hall, and the German physicist Klaus Fuchs in passing this information to the Russians. And our conclusion is that Greenglass had a relatively minor role, despite the fact that his contribution led to the execution of the Rosenbergs, that Theodore Hall gave the first information about implosion to the Russians. It was later, quite soon as a matter of fact, a month or so later, confirmed by the material independently given to the Russians by Klaus Fuchs. And so that Hall and Fuchs together, Fuchs probably gave them more information on the so-called initiator. Hall, that's one part of the problem that Hall didn't know about. But together between Hall and Klaus Fuchs, the Russians had what was very important to them, information from two independent sources about the diagram and the description of the bomb. So Beria, who was an extremely paranoid individual, tended to think that every piece of information that the Russians got was disinformation, was able to believe this information because it came from two sources. And even though Russia was completely devastated after World War II, was able to commit billions of dollars to create an atomic project. We should tell you that today, this 23rd of September, is the 48th anniversary of President Truman's announcement, this historic announcement that the Soviet Union had created an atomic explosion. So here, as we're talking today, we're finding a new explanation and light on that historic day 48 years ago when Truman had to announce that the United States had lost its nuclear monopoly much sooner than the CIA thought it would.
You found it necessary to point out that this is a quote from the book. Frugal as always, Ted Hall printed out the document which you received and reprinted at the end of the book on the backs of 2 spoiled pages of a philosophical essay that one of their friends had given them. Why is that significant?
Oh, it just is it's a little piece of human light on what kind of people these are. You know, he was a spy 50 years ago, but he lives an everyday life now, and he's not being hounded by the press or the police. He's a real human being, and he and his wife live in their small row house in Cambridge, and they have a nice garden, and they're rather frugal people. They aren't, they're not poor or anything like that, but you know, they're just careful, and this was just an effort. There's no great significance to it. It was just an effort to kind of humanize them a little bit and to give another dimension of their characters.
And he dates this March 24th of this past year, saying, "Now I am castigated in some quarters as a traitor, although the Soviet Union at the time was not the enemy, but the ally of the U.S." Is that how he views it?
Yes, in fact, that's true. In the 1945, as we have to remember, the Allies against the Nazis were the Russians and the British and the French and the Americans. So they were technically allies, and no question about it. Now, the fact is, Ted Hall continued to be a spy after the war, when they were after the Cold War had begun. As we point out, the last contacts between Hall and the Russians was not until 1953.
Atlanta, good morning.
Good morning. I had read an article in my local paper, actually almost a whole page, about this man last week, and I tore it out and shared it with my husband last night. Just to put this in layman's terms, this man was a traitor, and it is a pity that he was not kept in this country and tried and executed, because he is responsible for American young men losing their lives in various military missions that we were involved in because the Russians had this information. And I'd like to just put that in layman's terms. Instead of humanizing him, I'd like to demonize him. But I do thank you for writing the book.
Thanks for calling.
Well, actually, we tried not to make judgments about what he had done. We tried to present as fair and as complete a case as we could present. And really, we're trying to leave it up to people like you to make your own decisions about what Ted Hall was and about what he did. We by no means approve what happened and what he did, but I think you have to be a little bit careful when you're talking about words like traitor and treason, because, you know, there are very specific definitions, and the crime of treason is committed when someone aids and abets an enemy during time of war.
Did he go to the Soviets, or did they come to him?
Ted Hall made his own decision to approach the Soviets. While he was on a furlough in New York, he decided that he would go and knock on the door of the Soviet trade agency Amtorg, and that's what he did. He and his, with the help of his Harvard roommate, set up their own network. He makes the point that nobody recruited him, that he made this own decision, that he made the intellectual steps necessary to decide that the world's power balance had to be shifted by a boy of 19, and he did it.
Chicago, good morning.
Morning. My observation is, and it always seems that these super intellectuals always can justify turning over things, and especially with him, millions of people that were killed, and the country went for 70 years and wound up in the ditch practically with nothing. I'm always interested in how these guys can justify in their mind selling out their country. I notice he lives in England. He doesn't live in the Soviet Union, because he knows good and well if he'd been over there, if he hadn't crossed a T or dotted an I right, he'd be dead now. But that's just my observation. It seems that when I have things I watch at C-SPAN, which I truly think you guys are probably the best thing on TV, but anyhow, I've just always noticed it seems like that type of people can always justify in their minds, and I don't know whether they talk to him about this or not, but that's just my observation. Thanks again.
Well, thanks for calling. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. People do justify in their own minds what they do. And that was what we were trying to get at. We're not saying that he was justified by any means, but what we're trying to do is find out what the motivations were. How does he explain it? Just to better understand. I think it's important that you do, as Americans, understand why somebody would commit an act like this. When he did this, there were more than 100 people who were in some way cooperating with the Soviet intelligence agencies, and this information is now has come out in these National Security Agency decrypts, and I think it's very important. And the Deputy Chief of the National Security Agency, Mr. Crowell, said exactly the same thing, that when we release these, let's give the historians some time to look at it and to see what can we learn from it. And I think this is one thing that is very important for us to do, is to try to learn why would someone do something like this, because if you don't know that, you can't prevent it from happening again.
Grew up in Ohio and formerly the bureau chief for Cox Newspapers in Moscow.
Right. Joe was my bureau.
And Joseph Albright, native of Chicago and also with Cox Newspapers, and before that the Chicago Sun-Times. Before I let you go, the Reliable Source this morning has a picture of the two of you and two things that you'll learn. First of all, the former husband of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Did she help you with the book? Has she read the book?
She may have read the book. She's certainly aware of the book. We've talked about it, but I didn't tell her that we were working on it until the book was done.
And also, the article points out that this is now being turned into a movie?
Yes, well, it's very exciting. It's been optioned by a production company. That does not necessarily mean it will turn into a movie, but they've got this fabulous young star, Leonardo DiCaprio, who has agreed to play the role of Theodore Hall, so we're very excited about that. We hope it happens.
What's your next project?
Well, next project remains to be seen. That's top secret.
Joseph Albright and Marcia Kunstler, co-authors of Bombshell, The Secret Story of America's Unknown Atomic Spy Conspiracy. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.